All right, guys, I'm going to be really blunt with you. I don't understand what happened in the American League in 1905. Yeah, this is one of those stories that like you only get into if you're really a geek for this stuff and you're spending just way too much time reading into it and looking at it. But let's take a look at this. We're going to look at this replay first. The entire complexion of this video has changed. This is actually my second take on it because I realized that there was this issue. So this is a replay using ballpark baseball of the 1905 Major League season. The person who made this replay put it up on Delphi Forums, finished it about 12 years ago. I'm not sure if he's even around anymore or not. I haven't gone on to post and look. Ballpark baseball is a game that is not very well known, created by Charles Sidman, I think is his name, back in 1957. He was a professor at Kansas University. My understanding is that among other people, Bill James played this game way back in the days. Ballpark baseball never was really advertised the way the Strat-O-Matic and APBA were, and so it's not that easy to find a lot of full season projects using the game. People who play it or who know about it will claim that it's extremely complex, but apparently it's not. It took this replayer about a little over 2 years to finish it, not quite 2.5, which means that it's probably about the same as APBA or Strat-O-Matic, and I've read people say that it takes maybe 30 minutes or so to play a game. But of course, none of that's really the interesting thing here, right? And I'm not going to go into detail, at least right now, about how Ballpark works, how it's different from the other games or anything like that. We can wait till later for that. Now, the interesting thing here comes when you look at these stats, right? Especially the American League pennant race. So the Philadelphia Athletics won 96 games and lost 56. And the Chicago White Sox, who finished 4.5 games back, won 94 and lost 64, right? But there's a problem. Now, it may take a little while to do the math, but you'll figure this out pretty quickly. The Athletics played 152 games, 96 plus 56. The White Sox played 158, 94 plus 64. So neither team played the 154 game schedule, right? What happened and why? Well, let's go take a look. So what happened here in real life is the Philadelphia Athletics won 92, 56, and 4. They had 4 games that counted as ties in the standings. But as you know, those tie games don't really count as ties, right? They played overall only 152 games out of the 154 game schedule. I haven't actually looked to figure out what the original schedule was, but for whatever reason, they didn't play a full schedule. In fact, they didn't even play out the last game of the season at Washington that ended in a tie 3-3 after 5, interestingly enough. And it's right after they lost to Washington the game before. The White Sox, meanwhile, went 92, 60, and 6 for 158 games. And again, some of those tie games were made up, which is how they ended up with 158. In fact, I'll tell you, 4 of those tie games were made up, and there were 2 others that probably should have been made up but were not. And so that's what happened with the White Sox. In fact, they had a tie game there on October 7th when they were still within reach of the pennant. So this is where it becomes really confusing, right? The problem that we have with 1905 is that it doesn't make any sense, right? So this is the Chicago Daily Tribune on October 7th, 1905. St. Louis blasts last hope of Sox. Browns beat Comiskey's men and Athletics clinch hold on pennant, score 6-2. And here it tells us that the Athletics can lose both of the remaining games with Washington, which was the doubleheader we just looked at, and Chicago can win all 4 of its games here. This is in St. Louis, but it will avail them nothing so far as the flag is concerned, right? So that would have made the Athletics 92 and 57, and Chicago would have been 94 and 59, right? You see the problem. The problem is that the Athletics played fewer games than the White Sox, and yet won the pennant on the basis of playing fewer games. This is a major problem. This is a huge, huge concern, and it becomes really complicated. When you look at the original 1905 standings, you see it right away. The White Sox finished 2 games behind the Athletics, but won the exact same number of games and lost 4 fewer games than the Athletics. In other words, the Athletics won the pennant because they played fewer games than the White Sox. But the thing that drives me nuts about this is that I go searching through these old newspapers and nobody talks about this, or it's just like the way that it is. is. I'm thinking nobody in 1905 looked at this and said, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. You have one team with 152 games, another team with 148 games played. Neither team played the 154, and yet you're giving the pennant to the team that played fewer games, right? I mean, how does that make sense? Why did this happen? Now, I know what you're going to say. Yes, this did happen at other points in time, the dead ball era. And I'm assuming that there's some sort of reason or there's some sort of practice or something that made it so that this took place. But the important thing for us is not necessarily the historical reasons for this. No. The important thing for us is to know about this problem when we play through our replays, because the last thing you want to have happen is one team end up winning the pennant because they played fewer games than the team in second place. And that's exactly what happened in this replay, right? That's exactly what the problem is. Now, how did this happen? I'll show you how this happened. It's pretty simple. The person who played this replay decided to play every game as it was recorded here on Baseball Reference or on RetroSheet, whatever it was that he used, right? Without worrying about whether the game was a draw in real life and without looking to see what the original schedule was, right? That's why the Athletics had exactly 152 games played, and the White Sox wound up with 158. Now, Ballpark Baseball apparently didn't allow for games to be called of darkness or rained out or whatever, and that's the reason why you have this really lopsided standing, right? But it doesn't make sense. That's the problem. It doesn't make sense. It's not fair for a team to play more games than they're supposed to and lose the pennant because they played more games. So now you see the problem. Many people have asked, why use the as scheduled schedule, not the as played schedule? Why not use real life lineups? I'm pretty convinced that this replay used the real life lineups. This problem is the reason why. Right? Because it's not fair to have a team lose the pennant because they played more games than the team that won the pennant. And also because it's a total headache if you start going back and trying to undo tie games and trying to figure out which tie game or which double header was meant to replace which tie game and which game wasn't replaced and all that stuff. It becomes a real problem that takes way too much time when you're setting up your replay. This is why I recommend creating your own lineups. Use the real transactions, but create your own lineups and use the as scheduled schedule and just try to make it as realistic as you can so you can avoid this problem. You can avoid having a team win the pennant because they played fewer games. Now, since this is replay reviews, we'll take a closer look at this. I hate to come on to totally come down on a replay like this because I know it's a project that took this guy 2.5 years to finish, but this has to be said. For those of you interested in making your own replays and you're trying to figure out how to start, that's one thing to look out for, especially from an old season. Make sure the teams are all playing the same number of games, right? It might be important. In this case, it is important, and I think the White Sox perhaps could have won the pennant if both these teams played 154 games, right? Very controversial. Meanwhile, in the National League, the Giants won 112 with a 723 winning percentage, and I'm not even talking about it, so there you go. Take a quick look here at these statistics. The batting average appears to be correct in the American League. In fact, all the rate stats seem to be right, so bold are the real-life stats, right? 241 to 241, well, that's pretty good. 310 slugging percentage compared to 314, which is good, and then a 297 on-base percentage compared to 299. All of that is kind of where it needs to be. It's right on. Now we'll take a look at the National League, and you can see it right in front of you here. There's a problem. National League batting average was almost 10 points higher than it should be. Slugging percentage was right around where it needs to be, so it was still the dead ball era, but on-base percentage also about, 6 points higher than it needs to be. That's not the end of the world. That's not a sign that, the replay was a complete failure or anything. Of course not, but it's not really where we want it to be. We want it to be a little bit closer than that if possible. You'll notice also that there were far more at-bats in the replay than in real life, which means that the number of hits were higher and so on and so forth. I'm going to tell you that the reason for that is almost certainly because the replayer decided to use the as-played schedule and just played every game without thinking about it instead of playing with the as-scheduled schedule and trying to do something that was a little bit more even. Because instead of having games be called by rain or darkness after a couple innings, these have now turned into complete games, right? That will give you more at-bats. That'll give you more innings pitched, which is another problem that we see here. That's a big issue. Now, ERAs end up being higher than they were in real life, which I think may point to an issue with the ballpark game engine. Again, we're not going to go into this, but this is concerning. The American League had a 2.74 ERA compared to 2.65 in real life. That is too high. It's 9 points too high. That's a concern. Note that the replayer did a great job of having the right number of complete games. Again, everything that the replayer seems to have control over seems to be right on, with the exception of how the schedule itself was handled. In the National League, though, the ERA is way off, 2.99 in real life compared to 3.20, which is not really a dead ball era ERA. I've got to wonder about this one because that's a little bit strange, right? You see, again, complete games almost exactly right, which is amazing and which is really commendable, but a lot of these other stats are off. And what I was just talking about in terms of number of games played shows up because you have average 617, 617, one loss instead of 606, 606, right? And that tells you how many extra games we're looking at. That is a problem. Fielding percentages were also not quite on. This is so interesting after looking at what Clifford Van Beek reported from National Pastime. Now, it's possible that Van Beek was just making something up out of thin air. I still don't believe it because he doesn't put in the real-life statistics for the purpose of comparison, but who knows, right? Here, the American League had a 950 fielding percentage, which is considerably lower than the 957 in real life. National League had a 948 fielding percentage, again, lower than 954. But interestingly enough, the National League ERA was so much higher despite the fact that such a higher percentage of balls in play were errors. So interesting stuff to look at. If you're interested in the World Series, there's not much to talk about there. The New York Giants swept the Athletics in 4 straight with Mathewson and McGinnity winning 2 each. It's pretty obvious that the replayer was trying to use real-life lineups and pitching rotations because he did for the World Series, having both Mathewson and McGinnity pitch with 2 days rest just as they did in real life. I'm not sure if that's necessarily like the right thing to do or not, and I think it's somewhat debatable. But I will say that in my opinion, when it comes to a replay like this, you really, really want to stick with the as scheduled schedule and not the as played schedule. I know it's hard to make lineups, but I think that you're better off making lineups and having standings at the end of the season that makes sense. Because when you have something like this one, where the team in second place lost the pennant because they played 4 games more than they should have, that's a problem. Anyway, there you go. Love to know what you guys think about this one. This was a fascinating replay to look at. My only other little bit of advice or sort of regret for the person who made this replay is that they had game summaries for like a handful of games at the start of the replay, and then after that, everything was just box scores. And that really is a shame because some of us really like to read the story about your replay instead of just looking at the stats. So when you make your own replay, keep that in mind and take the time to write something out, right? There are some things written out here, but I mean, there are a lot of questions that I have about how this is set up and a lot of observations like I've just made that are things that probably should have been talked about while the replay was going on. Anyway, there you go. That's sort of my take on this. Love to know what your take is. Let me know down below. Talk to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.